Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Reclaiming Lost Lands, Revitalizing Brownfields with Green Infrastructure. Our speakers today will be Matt King, Aimee Storm, and Carrol with EPA, and Anna Withrow with the West Virginia Water Research Institute. Before we get started, let's review just a couple housekeeping items. So all attendees have been muted to minimize background noise. If you have a question during the presentation, please type that into the questions box on the upper right-hand side of your screen. We're going to have a couple designated times to answer questions throughout the presentation, so do type in your questions. If you are experiencing any technical difficulties, please type your concerns into the chat box, and we'll do our best to troubleshoot the issue. Also, during today's webinar, we'll be showing a brief video, which is going to play through your computer's speakers. So when it comes to that part, be sure to turn up your computer's volume so you don't miss anything. Before diving into the presentation, I'd like to take two brief polls so we can get to know our audience a little better. So the first question we have for you is, how many people are viewing this webcast with you? That would be how many people are there in the room with you. So if you just want to take a second and fill that out. Great. It looks like most people are viewing this independently. Excellent. And I have another poll question for you. How many years of experience do you have with green infrastructure? And you can answer the poll question by directly clicking on your screen at this point. Okay, great. It looks like a lot of you, we have varying experience. Lots have more than 5 years. But then we have the full range, which is wonderful. And now I'd like to introduce you to our first speaker, Matt King. Matt King has worked in EPA's Office of Wastewater Management since 2009, where he's a member of the Green Infrastructure team. His work is focused on engaging national stakeholders to encourage the implementation of green infrastructure practices and prevent stormwater pollution. Welcome, Matt.
Thank you very much, Amanda. The Office of Wastewater Management is home to the National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System Permitting Program, including the NPDES Stormwater Program. Pollution associated with stormwater runoff is a serious issue across the country. Population growth and development continue to increase the scope and severity of the problem. In the Office of Wastewater Management, our green infrastructure work is focused on stakeholder engagement, communicating the environmental, economic, and social benefits of green infrastructure practices, and where practical, increasing green infrastructure implementation across the water sector. One of the interesting aspects of working in the green infrastructure arena is the variety. Green infrastructure is a broad term that encompasses a large array of best management practices and draws from a multidisciplinary group of practitioners. I think today's webinar topic will demonstrate that. EPA and our team of presenters today appreciate your interest in this important topic. Next slide, please. Stormwater runoff is a major cause of water pollution across the United States. When rain falls on our roofs, streets, and parking lots in cities and their suburbs, the water can't soak into the ground as it should. Stormwater drains through gutters, storm sewers, and other engineered collection systems and is discharged into nearby water bodies. Along the way, it can pick up trash, bacteria, heavy metals, nutrients, and other pollutants. These contaminants degrade water quality and threaten public health. Next slide, please. The presence of nutrients and other pollutants can turn stormwater runoff into a serious threat to public health and the environment, not just at the site and local level, but larger scales as well. Using nutrients as an example, nitrogen and phosphorus in stormwater runoff can result in abnormal algal growth in receiving water bodies. Some species of algae secrete toxins that threaten drinking water supplies and aquatic life. Pictured on the left is a drinking water intake in Lake Erie, near Toledo, Ohio, where an algal bloom as a result of nutrient pollution threatened that city's water supply. As algae die and decompose, they further deprive water bodies of oxygen, creating aquatic dead zones. Pictured on the right is the Gulf of Mexico, where you can see plumes of nutrients and algal blooms, which are responsible for creating the dead zone that many people are familiar with. This is where green infrastructure practices can play a valuable role in protecting public health and the environment. Next slide, please. So what exactly is green infrastructure, and what's the difference between green and gray infrastructure? Gray infrastructure is designed to move stormwater away from the built environment. By contrast, green stormwater infrastructure uses plants, soils, and other media to capture, treat, and evapotranspire stormwater at its source, where it falls. By managing wet weather in this manner, green infrastructure has the potential to provide numerous environmental, social, and economic benefits. The term green infrastructure encompasses a wide variety of practices, including downspout disconnection, rainwater harvesting, rain gardens, planter boxes, green roofs, and more. What's the connective thread between all these practices? They manage water where it falls instead of conveying it somewhere else. The variety and flexibility of green infrastructure makes it a great solution for stormwater management in a variety of scenarios. But contaminated sites, such as brownfields, can present unique challenges for practitioners. That's why I'm pleased to have with me today a group of speakers that can talk about the implementation of green infrastructure on brownfield sites and share some local success stories. And with that, Amanda will introduce our next speakers.
Great, thanks, Matt. Today we have Carrol and Aimee Storm with us. Carrol has worked for over 30 years on environmental and public health protection, including brownfields, lead poisoning prevention, risk communication, and contaminated site cleanup domestically and internationally. Anne has a science and public health background and has been with the U.S. EPA Office of Brownfields and Land Revitalization in Washington, D.C. since 2002. She's worked as a staff lead on brownfields, revolving loan funds, petroleum brownfields, public health, research and training, urban agriculture, and health improvement through revitalization. Joining Anne today is Aimee Storm. Aimee Storm is the Land Revitalization Coordinator and Acting Policy Research and Outreach Team Leader for EPA's Office of Brownfields and Land Revitalization. Her work supports community-led remediation and redevelopment of contaminated properties and associated neighborhood revitalization strategies. Thanks for joining us today, Anne and Aimee.
Hi, this is Anne.
Hi, this is Aimee. Thanks everyone for being on our on this webinar, and thanks to Matt for including us.
Yes, absolutely. So we were asked to introduce really the Brownfields 101. And so what you have hopefully before you are some of the things we'll be talking about today. So I'll be kicking us off. This is Anne. I don't expect you all recognize my voice. And then I'll be turning things over to Aimee for the next part of our presentation. And then after that, we'll do some tag teaming. So I'm here to talk to you a little bit about what brownfields are and also where they are. And then, as you can see, we'll be talking about the brownfield grants and technical assistance, brownfields and green infrastructure connections, and really some key questions we ask our grantees and our project partners to think about. And then I think we'll be able to take a few questions after ours before we switch over to Anna. So without any further ado, what are brownfields and where are they? So I'm not going to get into the statutory definition of brownfields, but essentially it's not only a property that is contaminated, but it's also properties that are perceived to be contaminated. And so the good news is some of those sites that are brownfields that are being proposed for green infrastructure, it may be perfectly fine because the brownfield wasn't actually contaminated or at a level above a health concern. So rather than kind of going into what all the different types of sites that are included in brownfields, sometimes we can also define it by what it isn't. So a brownfield is not a Superfund site. It is not a site listed on the national priorities list or a federal facility owned and controlled by the federal government. And it's not an active enforcement site. But we talk about it as real property that has real or perceived contamination from hazardous substances, pollutants, or contaminants. And so examples often are industrial, commercial, and residential sites. For example, dry cleaners and strip malls, drug labs were something that was added as part of our Brownfields amendments to CERCLA in 2002. Low-risk petroleum contaminated sites, so when you hear that, think abandoned gas stations or heating oil site areas, and mine-scarred lands. And you just see some rather dramatic examples in this slide. So the Brownfields program really evolved as a pilot program from CERCLA, CERCLA being the legislative law that we all know as Superfund. And so the Brownfields pilot program was developed really to deal with the sites that weren't the most contaminated, but were the numerous. And so the pilot program started with one grant in 1993, 3 grants in 1994, and then after that, we've been pretty much doing annual competitions for communities that want to identify those abandoned, foreclosed, underused properties for their cleanup and safe reuse. And so we think of the 1995 to 2002 as the pilot period, and that's where we awarded grants for primarily assessment, but some cleanup. But with the Brownfield amendments to CERCLA and the law that was passed in 2002, it gave EPA new Brownfield cleanup authorities, and that was expanded the Brownfields program, and that also included some of those definitions I gave you earlier. Now, very recently, the Brownfields law was we had a statutory reauthorization that was in March of 2018. And so again, we were given a new kind of grant authority for a multi-purpose grant. And so we'll talk a little bit about those different kinds of grants and awards we give. And we would absolutely encourage you to check out the EPA Brownfields website. We are a little restricted in what we can say right now because we have just posted our new grant guidelines. So that's why I really encourage you to go to our website and see about the new grant competition and the applications. So again, just kind of illustrating that Brownfields came from Superfund. So Superfund sites are really known as the most hazardous, the uncontrolled and abandoned hazardous waste sites. And those are the high priority sites. And so they require a number of resources to restore and manage them because they're very complicated, contaminated sites. On the other hand, the brownfield sites are those both really contaminated, but not very badly, but they are distributed around the country. And so early estimates were there were between 100,000 and 600,000 brownfields. We actually don't count. I mean, we've kept track of who has received a brownfield grant, but there is no real estimate at this point about how many brownfields there are. But the key thing is we make resources available for communities, for them to identify those sites that are in their area, to determine if they need cleanup, and also to seek the funds for cleanup if they need it. And we work very closely with state and tribal environmental programs to make sure those cleanups are overseen by the state. So here's a very colorful example of a brownfield site, a former metal scrapyard area, and that gives you a list of some of the contaminants, but again, depends on the kinds of sites that communities are seeking. So the list of contaminants is changing all the time. But petroleum fuels and hydrocarbons, certainly from abandoned gas stations and other places that had the fuels, lead and other heavy metals, as Matt mentioned earlier, polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons. Those are the incomplete combustion products. volatile organic compounds, so those things that can turn into a gas or a vapor. Think of dry cleaning solvents and things like that that can vaporize. Pesticides, not only because of, former agricultural uses, but also sometimes around residential or commercial. So, for example, a lot of grocery stores used a lot of pesticides to keep rodent populations down. Asbestos, and then, of course, there are those lucky sites that have all of those things. So we do have a lot of mixtures at different kinds of sites. And there is a process. I won't belabor this point, but essentially we award different kinds of grants to do different parts of the steps of this process. And so it is recommended that people conduct a site assessment before they acquire property, and that is usually what they are required to do by their lender, by their insurance company, is to conduct a phase 1 environmental site assessment. And they do that because they want to get protected from environmental liability. And so we call it a phase 1. It's also sometimes referred to as AAI, which is all appropriate inquiry. And then in the commercial transaction arena, it's called due diligence. And so those terms are sometimes used interchangeably. And again, check out the Brownfields website to get more details on that. And so a community can apply for an assessment grant that will help them do that phase 1. And that will kind of figure out what it is that they're going to be acquiring when they acquire that property. And so there is a public participation requirement of that. And then there's also, you might discover that there is additional investigation that's needed. There's something about the history of that property that suggests there might be contamination. Maybe it was a foundry or a dry cleaning site. Maybe it has abandoned gas station tanks. So then you would do further investigation, and that's really to start collecting soil samples, groundwater samples, look at buildings and structures that might need some characterization. You would also be conducting public participation as part of that. And then depending on what you find are the levels of and the distribution of contaminants of sufficient concern that it requires cleanup, then you'd be collecting samples so that you could plan a cleanup as part of that assessment phase. And if there was suggestion that there was environmental contamination, that's probably when you would be involving and working closely with your state involuntary cleanup program or response program. Essentially, they're the parallel brownfields programs at the state level. Anyway, I said I wasn't going to belabor it, and now I am, so I will move on, but you can imagine cleanup options, design, implementation. A key point for the brownfields program is you're cleaning up the site for a reuse. And so that very much influences the kind of cleanup you're going to do. And so if you wanted it to be green infrastructure, that's how you'd be planning your cleanup. This is just a map to show you the distribution of sites. As you can see, you can find us in many communities. And if your community has some of those kinds of sites, but you don't yet have a brownfield grant, this might be a very good webinar for you to be on to think about that issue. And so the Brownfields program really, again, to restate that, it's about moving that site into reuse. So it might have been an abandoned site. And so you'd want to convene, both the environmental folks, but maybe your community economic development, your public health department, your housing, the relevant organizations and community leaders to think about how could you use that site. And so that's where the EPA grant will help you convene those entities, think about what the risks might be at the site, and then you might not be prepared to apply for a grant. This might be the first time you've heard the word brownfield, in which case you can approach us directly and seek some technical assistance. And so Aimee will talk a little bit about who we fund that provides technical assistance. And of course, you can always contact the EPA and the regional brownfields teams directly. So our goal, might as well reach high, right? Because these are sites that have had this complicated environmental history, our goal is to not only address those issues, but really rebuild it in a better way. And so, many of them are in urban areas, but not all. And so are there ways that we can think about as part of our Brownfields project activity in protecting the environment and public health? Can we incorporate those stormwater management, green space needs that many of the communities where we work really need. And of course, I've just kind of put some of the key things that are of relevance for green infrastructure in bold, but of course, ideally, we want to be able to do all these things.
Thanks, Anne. Hi again, this is Amy. And before I dive in to the second part here to talk about the Brownfields grants and technical assistance that our program offers, I wanted to check in with Amanda. Did we have any questions come in yet from any of the things that Anne talked about?
Yes, we have. One is a general question. Lots and lots of people have asked the exact same question, wondering if your slides are going to be available as well as a recording.
Yes.
Okay. And do one of you want to mention where that'll all be found?
Okay. We thought that you guys were going to archive that, but we can make our slides available to the audience.
Right. We'll probably make them available in a PDF because it's a pretty large file.
Yeah.
Okay. And then another question we have is, could a brownfield have been a Superfund site at one time or never met the standards for the NPL national list?
Yes. So the answer is yes. A brownfield site that is eligible for EPA grant funding cannot be proposed or currently on the national priorities list. It cannot be those other things that Anne mentioned, like a federal facility owned or controlled by the government or an active enforcement site either. Those types of sites are prohibited from receiving Brownfields grant funding. But if the Superfund site has been deleted and is no longer, on the list, then that's one of the things that could be, that's something that could make the site eligible. The best thing to do over and over, we'll tell you this, is work with the EPA regional program to help determine any kind of site eligibility questions.
And one key point would be, and any entity that was responsible for that contamination is never eligible for our Brownfield grant.
The liability piece. Great. Thanks, Amanda.
Yeah, we do have one more question, if you have time.
Sure.
Someone is wondering, do landfill reclamation sites for park use qualify for brownfield grants?
So probably. Again, to talk with any specifics about a site that you're thinking about, you might want to, investigate for brownfield funding. Please, again, reach out to the regional office and have them work through that site eligibility with you. But in the past, we have seen sites like that come in and qualify.
And there are many different types of landfills, so that's why we probably, couch that carefully.
Yeah.
Great, that's it for questions for now.
Great, yeah, that would be great just to catch a few. Okay, so I would like to take a few minutes and tell you all about our Brownfield Grant and Technical Assistance Programs. What you see on this slide are the entities that are eligible to receive our Brownfield grants. So it's a pretty wide group. We can't have individuals, and there's no for-profit organizations that are eligible, but otherwise the entities you see here are eligible for all of our grants. Okay, so EPA's Office of Brownfields and Land Revitalization offers a lot of different grant programs. We have competitive grant programs and non-competitive grant programs, and we also have technical assistance that we offer. So under our competitive grants, we offer the multi-purpose grant, which is new this year. We'll talk about that. We have site assessment grants, revolving loan fund grants that we provide to a community to help capitalize a loan fund that can go help clean up properties. And then we also offer cleanup grants. We have these environmental workforce development and job training grants, and then we also offer research training technical assistance grants. On the non-competitive side, we give an allocation every year to states and tribes to fund their response programs. And then we also offer, we should have probably had this in the technical assistance section, but a targeted brownfields assessment program. Not a grant, but it is an opportunity to get one of EPA's contractors to come to the site that you're interested in and have it assessed. Other technical assistance that we offer is our technical assistance to brownfield communities. I'll talk more about that. And then we have land revitalization assistance from time to time. So that's the range of our programs. Now we'll talk a little bit more about them. The first group is our competitive grant program. This is what we, Ann mentioned earlier, how we have an open solicitation out right now for the assessment, cleanup, and multi-purpose grants. So anything we share on this webinar, we have to share with everybody. And there was also a webinar yesterday, which will be posted to our website if it's not there already, walking potential applicants through the requirements and guidelines for applying for an assessment, cleanup, and multi-purpose grant. So the multi-purpose grant, new this year because this is the new program that Congress authorized for us as part of the March 2018 legislation that reauthorized our program. We call it the BUILD Act. Basically what this is a grant that allows a community to do environmental assessment and cleanup all in the same grant, with one of the requirements being that there's an overall plan for revitalization for that area. So we are looking forward to seeing how this grant comes together. The funding that we're looking at this year is up to $800,000 per grant. We do see a very limited number of these awards for the first year. Congress put a cap on basically how much money we can provide in the form of multi-purpose grants. So we're going to be trying it out this year. So that's our new one. Then we also have assessment, cleanup, and revolving loan fund grants that we've been offering for annually for a lot of years. The assessment and cleanup grants are, the solicitations for those grants are out right now. And you can, for doing the activities that you see here. And then revolving loan fund grants is not available this year, but it's one that we will have available next year. And here's a little bit more about where you can find the grant solicitation and grant guidelines. Please note the deadline, January 31st. And then that is the website, so you can also Google it and find it.
Yeah.
There's a lot of resources on there on the website about not just what the programs are, but giving you ideas on how to apply and FAQs and dealing with grants.gov and that whole process. So let's move on. Okay. Again, in the non-competitive realm, we have a allocation that our program is able to provide every year to state and tribal programs so that they can fund their, what we call a response program or a voluntary, sometimes called a voluntary cleanup program. And so with these funds, a state or a tribe is able to do the 4 activities that you see listed here on the slide. And one of the new and exciting parts of this allocation program is that we have, again, through the BUILD Act, there's a stronger emphasis on capacity building. So this year, there's an opportunity for the recipients of these funds, state and tribes, to kind of work more closely with a specific community and help build their capacity around brownfield issues. Another grant that we offer is our Environmental Workforce Development and Job Training Grant Program. Not offering it this year, but you'll see it next year. And this is such a wonderful program because it really targets people who have been affected by the environmental contamination, hazardous waste in their neighborhoods, and the cleanups that are happening in their neighborhoods. This gives people an opportunity to join a job training program and learn the skills so that they can participate in the cleanup and benefit that way. So we have a few pictures of the activities that our job training folks have participated in over the years. Primarily an emphasis on hazardous waste cleanup, but in the last few years, the program has been expanded to offer some wastewater training, stormwater training, also pesticide training, and disaster preparedness. Thanks, Anne. Okay. Yeah, so kind of just taking a step back from our grant programs, just wanted to share with you all a little bit of the philosophy that we have. We spend a lot of time in our Brownfields program talking about revitalization and, you know, how to do that, how to help communities basically reclaim these sites, as the title of the webinar says. You know, these sites, they're all over, and we want to be able to help communities deal with those sites in a safe way and help them have a path forward for how to reuse them. So consequently, we see tons of connections to all sorts of different ways the built environment can support brownfields and how we can support through brownfields public health and environmental health outcomes. So green infrastructure, because of all the reasons that Matt mentioned, it's really important, and it's something that we see our communities being very interested in. And so we want to support their efforts to help incorporate green infrastructure as much as possible. At the same time, we're also encouraging our communities to make sure they know what the market supports and what their workforce is ready for, and what are the other needs in the community beyond just economic, because we think that brownfields, because of where they're located, have such an opportunity to really transform a community. So we've done a little bit of homework and research into looking at stormwater runoff and how cleaned up brownfields, or brownfields that have been remediated, you know, does the stormwater runoff actually reduce the contaminants? And so we've gotten some great results. There was a 5-study area. You can see the cities listed there. And we did find from looking at those 5 areas that all of these different contaminants, we had less runoff because we were able to clean them up. Okay. I mentioned earlier some technical assistance and research training opportunities that our program has. And so just wanted to mention here that our program is able to fund these 4 organizations right now. We've got a grant with each of these to help work on specific things that enable our communities to move forward on their brownfield sites. So for Groundwork USA, right now, Groundwork USA is out there helping, using our grant to help communities incorporate environmental justice and equitable development approaches into their brownfield projects. The Council of Development Finance Agencies is available to any brownfield community who wants to understand how local finance options work. So like how bonds work, how tax increment financing works, tax credits, anything like that. Brownfield communities can reach out to this organization and get support. The University of Louisville has been doing a lot of research into how to create a community-based tool to help distill some of the benefits of redeveloping a brownfield site. And then HMTRI, we should say that's the Hazardous Materials Training and Research Institute. And they have been supporting EPA's environmental workforce development and job training grantees. So those organizations just have grants with us for 5 years to specifically help communities work on those kinds of challenges. And then we also fund the 3 organizations you see listed here. NJIT is the New Jersey Institute of Technology. We fund Kansas State University and CCLEAR being the Creative Center, Center for Creative Land Recycling. And these organizations are use the grant money from EPA, again, to work with any brownfield community that has basically a brownfield question or a brownfield challenge, and they want to try to get some help and understand how to navigate the process and what have other communities done. So these organizations are there to, and we organize them by EPA regions, but basically these organizations are there to support any brownfield community and try to answer some of their initial questions.
So if you go to our website, you can see, based on the map, which one of these organizations you would contact for your area.
Okay, and then we do some technical assistance in the form of our land revitalization program. From time to time, our program has some resources that we're able to pay for a contractor to work directly with the community to support a range of issues that they might be facing in regards to reusing their contaminated property. And so we just listed here some of the top kind of requests that we get in for help for communities. And basically they ask us, how can my brownfield site support, these types of outcomes? So we work with them to help them figure it out.
Sorry. I jumped the gun there. So we, turning back to green infrastructure, as you might imagine, in many cases, brownfields are ideal for green infrastructure, but there are those occasions where, there's something about the contamination at the site that it might be mobilized by water going through the site, or there might be something about the area. So we've put together some fact sheets that are available on our website, and one is really a case study that shows how do you manage stormwater on compacted, contaminated soils in dense urban areas, and also some of the design principles, because sometimes you want to engineer water around a contaminated site. In other situations, you might be able to put it through the site. And so these might help those of you who hadn't really thought about that. It's very site specific, it's very contaminant specific, but it is something that in the brownfields world, we're very enthusiastic supporters of green infrastructure. We just don't want to make things worse than they might already be. And so again, the other kind of consideration we would have is what kind of structural challenges need to be considered. Certainly our Region 5 office and other colleagues have worked on areas that there's been a lot of demolition. And it turns out when you're bringing a lot of heavy equipment into areas that are demolishing properties, you're actually hampering the soil structure. You're doing things that are going to make it more difficult to put green infrastructure in the future. And so they've developed some guidelines and some ideas for people who are having to do that kind of scale of demolition. And I don't think I have the link here, and I don't think I remember to put it at the end of the presentation. So we'll follow up with that. And you can also go to the EPA Brownfields publications page to find this information on demolition guidelines. And so again, there's the brownfields piece, but your soil, plant health, and green infrastructure experts might have some ideas about the ways that you need to think about those structural challenges, both with green infrastructure and then green infrastructure in the context of brownfields activities. Okay. And so here's just an example, and perhaps people aren't always thinking of a bulk oil facility as your ideal green infrastructure, but as it turns out, it turned into an award-winning park in Missouri, and so that was really a very close collaboration between the city, between the environmental regulatory agencies, as well as the community advocates and those that really wanted to create a park in an area that needed it and also address this contaminated site in the downtown. And so, we have lots of examples, and so that would be another shameless plug for our website to give you some examples of ways that brownfields are actually supporting community infrastructure needs.
Yep, and here's our website, some specific documents that you could find. In 2014, we did a kind of roundup of all the different land revitalization projects that we've been assisting that involve green infrastructure. And then we have several examples. Here's just two that kind of would give you more information about specific locations and how they've been meeting brownfield challenges by and addressing brownfield infrastructure at the same time. Two more quick examples, fairly recent examples actually, and in both of these cases, our land revitalization component of our program was able to support these communities specifically. This first example being in St. Louis, working with these organizations to kind of address how would the different lots within this neighborhood, if they were to be used for green infrastructure, how would that support kind of like a system-wide approach to managing stormwater? So that was one very exciting project we got to be involved with and develop conceptual approaches for. And then the next one in Trenton, as part of the Essenplant Creek Greenway project, there was a site where the brownfield site where the stream was still underground, and there was a lot of effort and excitement on how to daylight that, but how to do that kind of given like the work that's been done before and the brownfield conditions. We were able to provide some assistance through landscape architects and stuff to help them figure out how to clean up the site, daylight the stream, and make it an integral part of their greenway. And we have lots of other examples. We're not going to get into it. Anna, we know, is going to talk, give you like a lot more exciting specifics. But if there are any quick questions that came in, we'd be happy to address them.
If our timekeeper allows.
Yeah, if our timekeeper allows.
And here's our contact details if you want to get in touch with us.
Great. Thank you so much, Anne and Amy. We have a lot of questions that came in. So how about, Matt, maybe you want to just cut me off when we've had enough with question asking for now so that we can make sure to get to Anna's presentation. But I'll start out with this one. When talking about brownfields, I typically hear about the upland sites. Are sediment sites part of the program? And if so, how are they addressed?
Yeah, we're not familiar with that. Is there anything you want to say about sediment sites? We don't see a lot of that.
No. I mean, is this like a sediment site in a riverbed, or is this more an area of dredged spoils? I mean, if it was an area that was dredged spoils, it could conceivably be a brownfield because of that, but I'm not sure that's what you're referring to.
Yeah.
We might need more clarification on this question.
Okay. Someone is actually wondering if you could put the contact information slide back up while we continue with the questions. Great, thank you. Another question we have is, assuming grants can be utilized for hiring private companies to provide design or analysis services with these types of grants. Oh, that's a question, I guess. Can grants be utilized for hiring private companies to provide design or analysis services?
Yes, so if the community or if the organization that's getting the grant wants to hire consultants or contractors to support the work that they are required to do, they can certainly do that. And design work design work that is targeted to helping to figure out how to reuse the brownfield site and then appropriately clean it up is the connection there.
In accordance with competitive bid requirements.
That's true. Federal government rules.
Okay. Someone is wondering who provides the job training for cleanup activities under the Workforce Development Program?
Great question. Do you want to check on that?
So there have been a range of different providers over time, and I think the key point in our program is it's not just about job training and skills development, it's actually to make sure that people are placed in positions. And so that's why it's often a community college, a workforce investment board, work together to really look at the market in their area and then train and give skill certification for those particular market needs. So nonprofit, community colleges, job training entities.
And our, again, on the EPA Brownfields website, there's a grant search tool, and you can easily pull up the different organizations that have received job training grants over the years.
Our next question actually kind of builds off of that one, asking for a little more details about the workforce development program. Is it an existing workforce program, or would the funding be used for the city to develop their own workforce development program related to brownfields?
So the workforce development program is really a Department of Labor kind of organized structure, and so I think probably our money wouldn't be sufficient for that, and so it would be looking at who are existing Department of Labor and workforce boards, and can you forge the relationships that can support your community?
Right. I mean, often I think the best way to think about this is that our funding can support kind of a curriculum of environmental workforce development and like certification courses and all of those pieces, but it cannot fund like all the pieces that you would need, like for soft skills and a lot of administrative overhead, those kinds of things. So tacking this on to an existing workforce development program is the way to go.
Right. And if you look at our website, that's what you will see as well.
Okay, we have lots of questions pouring in, so I think I'm just going to ask one more before we get to Anna, and then we'll save the remaining questions for the end. Someone is wondering, can you explain how brownfield redevelopment results in lower, lots of questions, in lower pollutant discharge than greenfield development? Greenfield developments in our state are required to meet all stormwater regulations.
I don't think we can do justice to that question. There's a report that summary slide was from, and so it was actually a comparison of brownfield redevelopment to greenfield development. So that person who really wants to dig into that, it's on our website.
Okay, great. Well, thank you everyone for all the questions. We welcome them, and we'll get to more at the very end. So with that, I'm going to pass things off to Anna Withrow. Great, thanks, Anna. Anna is a Brownfield Design Specialist at the Northern West Virginia Brownfields Assistance Center, where she currently manages NBAC's Technical Assistance Program, Mole River Town Program, and Special Projects. Much of her work focuses around rivers, trails, and large industrial sites, such as community assets. Anna helps local project champions to manage site assessment and remediation processes, serving as the liaison between the community groups and brownfield resource providers. Anna's background is in landscape architecture and environmental design, as well as education. Thanks for joining us today, Anna.
Thanks, Amanda. That was a great introduction. And I'm noticing that my last slide does not include my contact information as Anna and Amy's does. So I'm going to leave this slide up just for a minute for anyone that wants to jot down my email address there. What I'll be talking about today is the work that we do at the Northern West Virginia Brownfields Assistance Center and how we use waterways as a platform for brownfield redevelopment and some creative avenues, such as implementing the River Towns program on the Mon River. And I'll end with some success stories to end on a positive note. It's a little bit humbling to think about the issue of green infrastructure related to brownfields and the work that we're doing. As was outlined in the previous session, there's a wide array of funding sources that's needed for a successful redevelopment project, and every project is a little bit different. States and federal agencies have specific resources that are available for different steps along the process. And what I'm going to present today in terms of green infrastructure will just scratch the surface. And a lot of what I will say will demonstrate a need for additional resources for green infrastructure. And you'll see some examples from North Central West Virginia specifically. So some background about the West Virginia Brownfields Assistance Center. So we have 2 in West Virginia. We were state legislated in 2005. We have one at West Virginia University that focuses on the northern 33 counties of the state. And then we have a center at Marshall University that focuses on the southern 22. And each center provides assistance to project managers throughout the state to implement and acquire US EPA Brownfields grants, as well as additional resources for their projects. We also together host a statewide Brownfields conference that brings all the stakeholders together, and a lot of momentum is generated at that event each year. So at the Northern Brownfields Center, we're actually a program of the West Virginia Water Research Institute. And that's given us the opportunity for collaboration with the state's water stakeholders and opened up some new opportunities for us. We assist local project managers, as I mentioned, through our technical assistance program. And then we have additional programs that we are developing or implementing, including the West Virginia University Bad Buildings Program, Downtown Appalachia, and the Mon River Towns Program. What you'll hear about today is first the technical assistance features that we have, as well as some projects that the Mon River Towns is involved with. So at the Brownfield Center, I find myself a part of all sorts of conversations, from industrial site cleanups for commercial or industrial reuse to trail and kayak launch development. For us, waterways are a platform for all types of brownfield redevelopment. The waterfronts in your area may be different than what you're seeing here. They may be ocean or lakefronts. They might be more urban or more rural than this. But whatever the case, waterfronts are important community assets. And aside from the riparian edge being important for local ecology, for humans, a nearby waterway can be aesthetically pleasing enough or recreationally attractive enough to make you want to live in a place, which is really important for the economy. The water's edge has been attractive for industrial development as well. In the mountainous state of West Virginia, you find some of the flattest and most developable land along the wide river valleys of the Monongahela, the Ohio River, the Kanawha River, and others. These rivers are not untouched. As you can see here, from my experience, waterfronts are usually lined with active or inactive railways that provide access between various types of industrial properties. And sometimes these properties are occupied and active, and in other cases, they're vacant. Historically and today, industrial players want access. They want rail access, water access, highway access, and so forth, in order usually to move materials around. And waterfront properties oftentimes will provide these types of access. So it's important to remember that many facilities were developed and operated with the waterfront as the industrial backdoor. And prior to the Clean Water Act and other acts that were put in place, the waterfront was a dumping ground for industrial waste and so forth. This photo that you can see here was taken earlier this fall in Weirton, West Virginia. And a good point to keep in mind throughout the rest of thinking about this topic is that if a site, and I think the last question that Amanda shared sort of spoke to this, and that is, if a site was previously used and it's getting reused, you're preventing the development on some sort of green property elsewhere. So brownfield redevelopment is inherently, it's contributing to the effort of green infrastructure in that way. So aside from many brownfield sites being developed along waterways, all brownfields are impacting waterways because they're all in watersheds. And so you can see here some typical materials that you find on brownfield sites. You have containers. Sometimes these containers contain hazardous materials. Sometimes it's sealed and sometimes it's not. You often have rubble piles. And vacant sites are oftentimes dumping grounds for waste materials that's not associated with previous site use because the site's sitting vacant for that amount of time. You often also see decaying materials, and then as demonstrated in this photo on the left, or on the right, you have a lot of impervious surfaces between rooftops and paved surfaces. There isn't much room for water to infiltrate, and that's pretty common. So brown to blue in concept is something that we sort of ingrain in every aspect of our work at the Brownfield Centers, and that is recognizing that the impaired waterway is been impacted by human and development and activity upstream. So if it's impaired, it is in itself a brownfield. And so ways that we are implementing, trying to mitigate this issue, is trying to raise local awareness by exposing the waterfront and converting the industrial backdoor into a commercial and recreational front door. And implementing stormwater management best management practices throughout all of our work throughout a watershed. The Brownfield Center has collaborated with a group out of Pittsburgh called Revitalizing on this issue, and we've benefited from some resources that this group has made available to the public. I've listed their website here, and the two guides that I've found incredibly helpful are on the left, you see a guide for riverfront development, and this shows standards for how to convert an industrial backdoor into a place that people want to be. And then the resource on the right is for folks who get the point and they want to do this sort of thing in their community. You can find some good economic information that will help make this argument for this type of development in your community. A little bit more background on River Life. They started as a task force out of the city of Pittsburgh mayor's office, and they progressed into a nonprofit that focused on creating and implementing a riverfront master plan. And they say that they were involved in projects and stayed in the loop on projects that have transformed the riverfront. There's still a ways to go, but they've done a lot of good in that community. And some of the work that I'm going to explain that's happening in Morgantown is sort of following along in this with this model. So one of the programs I mentioned that we're implementing at the Brownfields Assistance Center is the Rivertown program. This program was developed by Pennsylvania Environmental Council and Macon Development Strategies. They started this in 2011 and implemented it in several rivers in Pennsylvania. This program is closely related to a program that they also developed called the Trail Town program, where they focus on the trail or the waterway as the community's central asset and something to focus revitalization around. At the Brownfield Center, we're working with the stakeholders in Pennsylvania to implement this program in 3 communities in West Virginia. And this map sort of unifies the communities that are along the Mon River. So these are the places we'll be looking at. You can see the West Virginia-Pennsylvania line here. The 3 communities where we're implementing this program in West Virginia are Fairmont, Morgantown, and Star City. And some of the ways, and then we partner with organizations in Pennsylvania that are working with the same model there. And some of the things that this program provides to the communities is we have meetings that are community specific, where we'll find ourselves having conversations such as about signage along a riverfront, remediating or reusing a brownfield site, installing new kayak launches, attracting new business to vacant storefronts, and so forth. And then we have meetings that are coalition-wide that bring the leaders from each community together, and they start focusing on larger issues like what are the things that these communities have in common with this common asset, and what are the things that we need to overcome, such as stormwater management throughout the watershed and ways to protect the assets. Some other things that the Mon River Towns program provides for the area is it promotes the riverfront for commerce, recreation, and ecology. And you'll see some of the ways that this occurs on the monrivertowns.com, where you can click on each, there's a little page for each community that talks about the different things that the community has to offer, usually from a tourism perspective. And then there are events that you can find on the website, as well as the Facebook page that I didn't list here, but you could easily find. You'll find that there are paddling events and different sort of river-focused events, concerts, and so forth that that they will promote on the website. So I'm going to highlight some of the work that we do. Oh, I forgot here. I will be switching back to Amanda. Amanda is going to be showing a video that features the Pennsylvania Mon-River towns, and so you can get a sense of the landscape there. So. Okay, and we're back to my screen. Okay, so moving just a few miles upstream of the footage where you see a place that looks very similar on the same river. You can see here some photos demonstrating some of the work we're doing with the Mon-River Towns program in Morgantown. On the left, you can see we're planning public art installation. There's a design charrette there in the center where we're planning the community's riverfront park. And then there on the right, we had some folks come down from River Life in Pittsburgh and do sort of a secret shopper day. And it was interesting to walk the riverfront with them and see their perspective on what we had going on in our community. Some other ways to tie this back into the Brownfields focus on the riverfront. First, we have a huge success. You can see the map here of Morgantown. This blue line that you see along the east side is the Caperton Rail Trail, which is a huge win for the riverfront and the community. It's converted this little linear property that was a brownfield spanning through the site into a trail that's converted the riverfront into a recreational space. And I'll talk more about trails pretty soon. Another way is that the city of Morgantown received a Brownfields assessment grant in 2014, and they started the conversation for planning the reuse of their brownfields in the community by looking at the waterfront and seeing the properties that they wanted to assess and plan the reuse for. And they focused here in the Sunnyside neighborhood. And for anyone that's familiar with the area, you can see a lot of revitalization occurring in that area. And then as they're ending their grant project here on the southern part of the town, they've been doing some assessments in the southern part there. And something that's spun off of the assessment grant process is there's a group of stakeholders in the community that convenes each month with the goal of creating and implementing a riverfront master plan. And there you see, our office with the Brownfield Center, we're at the table, as well as the city and other public stakeholders. You have nonprofits, and there's a group that's interested in flatwater paddling in the area, and they've installed kayak launches all the way up and down through the town. So folks that are involved in this group have brought a lot of life back to the riverfront. I mentioned that I'd get further into trails. So my next several slides, you'll see some information about that. Here is some data that was collected by the Rails to Trails Conservancy, and our local trails group, the Mon River Trails Conservancy. They found that the trail through Morgantown brings $6 million per year to the local economy, and this is through hard goods such as running shoes and bicycles, as well as for trail users who go out and have a beer after their bike ride. Abandoned railways provide unique opportunities for trail development, and oftentimes they're along waterways, so that they sort of go hand in hand. But you know, for folks that work on trying to revitalize sites, you know that to receive grants, you need to have a wide array of angles to achieve sustainability with your project. And something that's really great about converting abandoned railways into trails is the infrastructure that's left behind, such as bridges and the ownership structure that's left behind, as well as the grade for railroads is usually pretty, it's not too steep. So that lends to very user-friendly trails for your community. People of all ages and abilities can come out and enjoy that. And it's, there's a huge public health component to converting abandoned railways into trails. This is a platform that's helped a lot of local groups to push forward their trail development projects. The map that I showed you a little while ago that focused on the Mon River Towns program showed this area between Pittsburgh and south of Morgantown here. And you can see that the trails that are in this area, they feed into a network that's over 1,400 miles and spans across 4 states. And although the trail network is not complete, you know, there are completed trails that are connected by gaps of abandoned rail corridor that need to be connected in order to complete this network. And this big picture goal has provided a vision for local groups to promote the development of green space in their community. And something that I found working with folks to help them reuse brownfield sites, in a lot of cases, you're engaging the public to reuse a property that the public doesn't necessarily own. And it's not easy to say, hey, put green space all over your property. But if you're proposing a corridor through someone's property for this really great big vision so that you can achieve that, it's a way that, it's an easier way to start the conversation. So here's an example of bringing that regional effort into a local vision. You can see an abandoned bridge. This is in Harrison County, West Virginia. And this graphic was pulled from the Harrison Rail Trails Connectivity Plan that our office helped create in the spring of 2017. And you can see we're proposing here that a bridge be recovered so that it could be used for a rail trail. Some of the things that we're working on to help break down the barriers of trail development for folks that are involved in reusing brownfield sites. You know that to reuse an abandoned rail corridor, you would need to go through the same assessment and cleanup process for that corridor that you would for an entire brownfield site. And the process of that, and not only that, but then the standards for cleaning up an abandoned railway for a recreational purpose, the site would actually have to be as clean as a residential property. And so this process is quite onerous when oftentimes abandoned railways to rail trails, you feel like there could be just a prescriptive method for reusing these properties. So some of the things that we're doing in West Virginia, well, the West Virginia Department of Environmental Protection is working to create specific guidance and guidelines for creating converting abandoned railways into rail trails. They're also as they create that, they're working with our office and other stakeholders throughout the state that are working to convert rails to trails, and forming a statewide rail trails task force that helps share these guidance and guidelines and walk project managers through the process. And through this work, it's important to see what our neighbors are doing, what other states have going on with this issue, because what's safe in one state for this is going to be safe in another state. And so we are engaging in conversations about that. What I'm going to share with you here is something that I've been trying to share pretty widely, and something that's really been brought to my attention is the impacts demonstrating a need for green infrastructure throughout a watershed seem to become more real the closer that you get to a waterway. With rail trails being located downhill of much development, there are some unfortunate impacts that the lack of green infrastructure has on trails and other low-lying development. Considering all the hard work that we and other partners are working on to develop rail trails and converting these railways, I'm finding that these completed trails are a good point in case for demonstrating the need for green infrastructure. And so the Modern River Trails Conservancy is a group in North Central West Virginia that manages 40 miles of completed trail, and the trails that I featured in my talk here today. And this is a group that has a budget for maintaining these trails, and they've sustained for many years. In the fall of this year, they had to raise $50,000 in addition to their regular maintenance funding for emergency repairs that were associated with severe weather. And when looking at maps, I'll show you some of these photos here. Looking at the map, you can see that there's a lot of development uphill of this, where, you know, green infrastructure could have prevented these issues. So this photo that you see here on the left is a culvert that is continuing to get clogged anytime there's a very significant rain event. And the culvert is along the rail trail that comes through the WVU Core Arboretum. And I'm not sure the exact spot where you can find this specific culvert, but you can see all of the development that's uphill of that. And I did actually, since creating this presentation, learned yesterday that the Mon River Trails Conservancy received they're receiving a grant to fix this culvert by way of making it larger, so that so that the trail doesn't flood every time that it rains. And for folks, I saw the poll at the beginning, many folks have been involved in working in green infrastructure for many years. There's other solutions to making a larger culvert. However, when you're managing a project and you're trying to take care of your site, sometimes that's the solution that you have to work with. And I'm really glad to hear that they received the funding to fix this issue. Here's another landslide that contributed to the $50,000 that MRTC has had to come up with this fall. This is a landslide that's on the Mon River Rail Trail in Van Voorhees, and this is just downhill of a big school. So this is just sort of presenting an issue and something that really needs to be addressed, but I do want to end on a positive note. So in order to come up with the funding to fix these trails, and a fortunate thing is that trails really bring people together. People really love their rail trails, and it's a really great way to build community. So to raise funds to fix the trails, Black Bear Burritos, which is a really great restaurant in Morgantown, featured their rail trail repair quesadilla at a fundraiser event that was actually held last week. You can see that it was quite packed, and people buying this burrito and drinking beers contributed to fixing the trails. So I have a few, just sort of before I close, I have a few brownfield success stories, some case studies that are in North Central West Virginia and one that you'll find in the Eastern Panhandle. So here we're still in Morgantown. In the summer of 2018, there was a pedestrian bridge that was finally completed. There were abutments that previously held a trolley bridge, and those abutments sat for a lot of years with a big fence beside them. And this year, the community, this was a state-funded project, and there was a bridge put in place that connected an underserved community to not only the recreational trail, but it provided a really easy access to downtown where folks could go shopping and use it for utilitarian reasons as well. Here's another Brownfield success story, also on the Mon River. Some of the photos that I featured earlier in my presentation were of this quality glass factory that's in Van Voorhees, West Virginia. This property sat blighted for nearly 3 decades before the county took on ownership of it. And the county went through the acquiring US EPA funding to assess and clean up the site. And now what you see on the right is what the site looks like. There is a cap put over the entire property, and oftentimes for folks that are familiar with caps, there's a land use covenant that requires that the grass over the cap be mowed, and then the local paddling group, the Morgantown area paddlers, I encourage you to Google them. They do all sorts of really great things. That they've installed this kayak launch at the site, and there's a restroom and trailhead, and this is a really great success story. And then finally, I wanted to get in a little bit to the long histories that come along with these sites sometimes. So, you know, it's really great to see this before and after photo of a 9-acre brownfield site in the eastern panhandle of West Virginia, the before and after, but there's just so many details that go into this. And something that's really neat about this property is, unlike most of West Virginia, this property is in the eastern panhandle and is in a different watershed. Most of the state's in the Ohio River watershed. This is in the Chesapeake Bay watershed, where there are specific resources available for green infrastructure. And so looking at the history of the site here, it was originally developed as an orchard. Later, it became an automobile crushing facility, then an auto exchange property, then a pine furniture, where there was a large building on the site where they would build furniture, and then sometimes it would dump some of the stain and such out back. I mean, the things that come out in the environmental assessments can be surprising sometimes. And then the structure burnt down. The county took on ownership of the site and wanted to develop it as a soccer field. So you can imagine the challenges associated with glass and debris that was on the site, associated with previous uses, not to mention as an orchard, the pesticides that were used throughout the site. So, and something that really helped to spark the change and helped to lead to the down the road to clean up was seed funding for the group. It was a $5,000 group that helped the local team to get it together enough to prepare for brownfield cleanup applications, assessment applications, and in the spring of this year, the site was opened as a soccer complex, and it is now clean enough for young children to roll around in the grass, which is the highest standard of clean, I would say. So to conclude what all the things that I've shared with you today, this is just sort of a snapshot of the work that I do as it relates to green infrastructure. You can see that I wear a lot of different hats between being the liaison with federal and state agencies. I'm involved in a lot of different parts of the brownfield process, from identifying a site to cutting the ribbon at the end of the project. And we help to source the funding through this. I'm hoping that, I'm looking forward to the questions that you have for me today, but also I'm hoping that folks that are very familiar with green infrastructure will reach out with resources that for things that I might be missing and that we could be incorporating into the work that we do. So that's all that I have today.
Great, thank you so much, Anna. That was a really interesting presentation. Folks, I encourage you to type in your questions for Anna. And while you do type those in, we still have a lot of outstanding questions for Anne and Amy that I'm going to get to. So one of the questions that was asked for you, Anne and Amy, is, in addition to green infrastructure, do you incorporate climate change adaptation? Anne or Amy, are you on the line? Okay, it sounds like you are muted, so I can't hear you if you are on the call.
Okay. Sorry. We're here. Can you hear us?
Yes, now I can. Great.
Okay.
Do you want me to?
So the answer was yes.
Sure.
So we do have, actually, there's a couple of fact sheets that we had on our website for certainly requiring cleanups to think about climate and, you know, their location and proximity to natural hazards, flooding areas, but also wildfire areas, drought areas. And I don't think our fact sheets go into all that. They were more focused on flooding in the get-go. And then we have some documents. There's a kind of a climate resilience guide under our publications. I think we have a couple of publications on our website. Yeah, but you know, if the point is to make this a safe site and resilient for the future, then of course we have to think about what kind of emerging weather things we want to do. If we're going to be putting people on the site, we want to make sure they're safe and we're making wise investments. So yes, we are thinking about it.
Great, thanks. Another question we had was, you mentioned a couple case studies and let's see, design standard sheets. Someone's wondering how to access those or where you pulled those sheets from in the case studies.
So, they're from the website.
And which website would that be?
The Brownfields website.
Okay, great. So you can just go to the Brownfields website and access them.
Yeah, we have a publications spreadsheet, really, you know, section. So you can search for those. And also some of the other documents that we have cited have, you know, examples of those.
Excellent. Okay, thank you. Anna, we have a question here for you. Someone is saying that she is from Chicago and would love to know if there's been any information recorded on the process of engaging communities for redeveloping brownfields. I'm not sure if she's speaking specifically of Chicago. I don't think so. But just any information on engaging communities for redeveloping brownfields.
Ooh, that's a good question. Folks at EPA, do you have any specific resources? I feel like I'm finding my own way, and I've made some connections along the way that have helped with that process.
So the question is about the process for engaging communities in the Brownfields redevelopment process.
Yep, that's it. Mm-hmm.
Okay. So yeah, actually a number of things that come to mind. So as Anne said, public participation is something that we both encourage and require. And so there's just a lot of different ways that that's done, kind of running the range of kind of standard community meetings, the council meeting, you know, advertising, all the way through like design charrettes and pop-up, tactical urbanism, things like that. Lots of different examples of people giving site tours, doing that on the waterfront, you know, just lots of different ways to do it. One resource that I can point you to offhand is our technical assistance provider, Groundwork USA. And this you could find on the groundworkusa.org website. They have a lot of community engagement materials. Some things can help with best practices, you know, maybe help answer the question, hey, why are people not attending my meeting? Some tips on how to make those more engaging and reaching the audience that you want to reach. Do you want to add anything, Anne?
Yes, and I would also say that there's a document we hope to be putting out in the next year that is really going to talk about some creative community engagement activities. I think most of the Brownfields communities, you know, they get very excited about the design and visioning exercise, and so that's a good way to kind of bring people into the future, like what do we want this site to be? Also, the Superfund program has a community involvement coordinators and a conference, and they might have some useful information for people.
Thanks. And actually, we had someone type into the chat box and direct you, Mila, if you're interested specifically for Chicago. They say check out Urban Habitat Chicago. So that could be a helpful resource as well. We have another question here. Regarding greenways, railroads corridors can be very contaminated with various industrial uses. Are there standards for developing site-specific criteria in West Virginia under these conditions?
There are, and currently a rail corridor needs to be remediated to residential standards, which is incredibly safe for a rail-to-trail development. And as I mentioned, the West Virginia DEP is working to update these standards, and some of the things that conversations we've had when going through and considering this is, you have sections of trail that are through urban areas that are maybe right next to a playground where you might actually have children rolling around. And then you have sections of trail that are more rural, and there's just a trail that generally people just sort of whiz by. Some of the most common contaminants that are found on these are related to pesticides and herbicides that were sprayed in order to keep vegetation down along the railway, in addition to anything that's associated with spillage from the railway. So those are some of the things that we're considering with that, but currently there are standards, and the most prominent owner of rail properties in West Virginia, or one of the most prominent, is CSX, and they actually have specific standards that require a lot of cleanup in order to convert a railway into a rail trail.
Thank you. We have another question here. Is it problematic for grant distributors to look at brownfield sites as a linear project with many different contaminants, with many different contaminant areas along its path, compared to a more contained or singular site?
I wouldn't say that. A problem that I would observe with that sort of project is that oftentimes you do not have sometimes you do have miles of trail that you're focusing on, but with a lot of the projects that I've focused, it's been little segments, and that's a big challenge because in some cases the rail corridor would divert back to the adjacent property owners or what have you. So in some cases the ownership structure is makes it challenging. So you're dealing with smaller increments. But in the standards that I referred to, typically you would end up testing something like every 50 feet. So that ends up being a lot of testing.
Okay.
This is Amy. I can tack on to that. So in the Brownfields program, I think it is easy to think about the Brownfields redevelopment process as being very linear, but we've certainly seen a lot of successes from communities that don't do it in a linear fashion. And primarily we see, especially where there are multiple brownfield sites, maybe you don't really know which site to start with, which site has the most potential. You need more information from the economics of the site or other like infrastructure conditions, et cetera. So we also see, the community involvement piece, kind of what we were talking about, and the planning part for reuse. Sometimes you get community, the planning, and then you assess the site, and you think about what's feasible for actually how to reuse the site. Other times the site's assessed before the community planning process starts. So there's a lot of different ways that you can do this. Sometimes we've seen cleanup happen and then, additional site assessment in some places. So we know that it's not always a linear process.
Thanks for adding that. We still have lots of questions, but I want to respect all of your time since it's 2:30. So I'm going to pass things off to Matt to wrap up the presentation. And Matt, if you don't mind reminding everyone where they can access the recording for today's webinar.
Yeah, thank you, Amanda. I can definitely do that. Those were two really great, very informative presentations. And so first and foremost, I just wanted to thank our presenters, Anne, Amy, and Anna, for sharing their perspective and their expertise, and for helping us in the Office of Wastewater Management and our stakeholders learn how the stormwater management world intersects with other environmental programs. If you do have any additional questions or you'd like a copy of any of today's slides, feel free to contact me at king.matt@epa.gov. I'd be happy to help facilitate that. If you've already asked for a copy of slides over the course of the presentation, I can get your contact information from Amanda and get those slides to you. In addition, a recording of this webinar will be posted to the Green Infrastructure Program's website in about 2 weeks. You'll be able to access that presentation at www.epa.gov/green infrastructure. Lastly, I want to thank our attendees for joining us today. We appreciate your interest in green infrastructure and brownfields, and we hope you'll join us again in the future. Thanks, and have a great day.